The first thing my mother said when she saw me come through the door was directed at my sister. There she is, my successful daughter. She had her arm around Violet's waist, pulling her close the way you'd pull a prize closer to your body at a fair. Violet had just been named regional director at her real estate firm. Third promotion in 4 years, company car, expense account, the whole catalog. My mother had sent an email to every relative within driving distance of Kelowna 2 weeks before Thanksgiving to make sure everyone knew. I was standing on the porch mat with a bottle of sparkling cider and a container of wild blueberry jam I'd put up in September because I didn't know what else to bring to a house I hadn't visited in 8 months. My mother's eyes moved to me the way you'd glance at a weather forecast that confirms what you already expected. Overcast, chance of disappointment, bring an umbrella. 14 relatives packed into that living room. My aunt's husband was working the barbecue out back despite the October chill. There were cousins I hadn't seen since my grandmother's funeral, a neighbor my mother had apparently adopted into the family rotation, and my uncle, my father's older brother, sitting in the corner recliner with a glass of rye and water, watching the room the way men who've seen real things tend to watch rooms. My mother released Violet long enough to accept my cider and set it on the counter without looking at the label. I hear they've still got you doing paperwork for the government. Not a question. The kind of statement a prosecutor makes right before the real charge. She smoothed her apron with both hands. 37 years old, and they've got you filling out forms in some office in Victoria. I'm not in Victoria, I said. No, I know, you're always somewhere. She waved a hand. Never anywhere useful. 14 people in earshot. She knew exactly what she was doing. Violet added her line with the timing of someone who delivered it before. Mom worries about you. We all do. Her brow folded just enough to look concerned without committing to it. You seem tired. Are you eating? It wasn't a question about my health. It was a repositioning. Take the woman standing in the doorway with 8 years of calluses on her hands and shift her from capable to fragile in front of a live audience. Patient, not professional. Someone to be managed, not respected. The laughter came in a wave. Not mean, exactly. The kind of laughter that follows when someone in authority fires first and everyone else decides agreeing is safer than standing alone. I was holding my cup of tea. My aunt had pressed it into my hand on the way through the kitchen, and I looked at my mother across the room. Past the way she'd turned back to Violet already, past the 14 people who'd just been given permission to laugh, past 37 years of her deciding I was the rough draft. I said one word. Watershed. And the glass of rye my uncle had been lifting to his lips stopped midair. He set it down on the side table, slowly, the way you set something down when your hands have stopped being reliable. His face had gone the color of old concrete, and he was staring at me with an expression I'd seen exactly once before in my life. On the face of a man in a hospital corridor who'd just been told that something impossible had in fact happened. Good God, his voice scraped out low and rough, that's Watershed. The laughter died where it stood. Before I tell you why a man who spent 22 years with 442 Transport and Rescue Squadron, a man who'd flown through weather that would make most people reconsider their career choices entirely, had gone white at the sound of a single word, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe. Because what happened after that? Nobody in that room was ready for it. My uncle's name is Walt, not Walter. Walt, the way he introduced himself to everyone including people he'd known for decades, as if the formal version didn't fit the shape of him. He'd retired from the RCAF as a master corporal after 2 decades, mostly stationed out of Comox. He was 61 years old, with hands like a carpenter, and the posture of someone who'd never fully stopped standing at attention. He didn't ask for the floor. He didn't check whether anyone wanted to hear what he had to say. He pushed himself out of the recliner and crossed to the dining table, where someone had laid out photographs from Violet's promotion dinner, and he set something beside them. A folder, brown, soft at the corners the way paper gets when it's been handled more than it was ever meant to be. Inside were clippings, newspaper articles and printed wire service dispatches, 7 of them spanning 4 years. Everyone had been scrubbed to some degree, operational details withheld, identities protected. But Walt had made handwritten notes in the margins of each one, dates, location coordinates, aircraft types, the kind of annotations a person makes when they're connecting dots that someone else tried to scatter. I kept these, he said, voice carrying without effort into a room that had gone absolutely silent, because the person they were about never mentioned them, not once, not to her family, not at Christmas, not when the CBC ran a version of the story that got 3 things wrong and nobody corrected the record. He looked at me. I hadn't moved from where I was standing. This is your daughter, he said to my mother, not gently, this is what she does. The silence in that room had a texture to it. 14 people had stopped reaching for food, stopped refilling glasses, stopped performing the small, comfortable rituals of a holiday dinner. My aunt's husband had appeared in the back doorway, with tongs in his hand, and stayed there like a man who'd walked into the middle of something he didn't have a script for. My mother recovered first, she always did. Walt. Her voice dropped into the register she used for explaining obvious things to people who were being difficult about accepting them. I appreciate the kindness, I really do. But you know how Bryn can be. She's always had a flair for the dramatic. Even as a child, she lived in her own little world. She offered a small, patient smile to the room, an invitation to return to normal. Violet took it. She's been under a lot of stress, she said with the careful concern of someone filing a report. It probably sounds more intense than it was. Right, Bryn? The question was engineered, not asking whether I was well, asking whether I was willing to climb down and let the room breathe again, asking whether I'd confirm, right now, in front of everyone, that I was the one who'd been exaggerating. I looked at my sister. I picked up my tea, I set it back on the ring it had already left on the sideboard. I didn't answer her. Walt laid the folder flat on the table and spread the clippings out in order. She wasn't under stress, he said. She was under a whiteout. November, 4 years ago, northern BC, 70 kilometers north of Dease Lake, which is already so far north that when people in Vancouver hear the name of the town, they ask if you need a passport. 3 hikers had gone into the Cassiar Mountains on what should have been a 5-day route. On day 3, a weather system came in faster than any forecast had predicted. Environment Canada revised their models twice in 6 hours and it still wasn't fast enough. Visibility dropped to near zero. Temperature plunged. The hikers radioed in from a ledge, and then their radio went silent. Search and rescue scrambled from the nearest base. The weather was bad enough that the call came down from regional command within the hour. Stand down. Conditions too dangerous to fly. Resume at first light if the system cleared, which the revised forecast suggested it might. Possibly, with some luck, by mid-morning. There was a 17-year-old on that ledge. His name was Lucas. I'd seen it in the initial report. Lucas Ferraro, grade 11, Smithers, BC. First real backcountry trip. His father had signed the permission slip for the school outdoor education program. My co-pilot that night was a woman named Declan, short for something longer that she never used. 29 years old, engaged. She'd been with the unit for 3 years, and she flew like she'd been born in the air. When I looked at her after the stand-down order, and she understood what I was considering, she didn't argue. She checked her harness once, pulled it tighter by 1 notch, and said 2 words. Your call. That's what trust looks like when every regulation has been stripped away, and the only question left is whether the person beside you will bring you back. We flew into the storm. The helicopter took its first hit, a gust that came out of nowhere and dropped us 40 feet in 2 seconds. Before we'd cleared the first ridge, every warning light on the panel went amber. I killed the audio alarm because I needed to hear the rotors, not the machine screaming at me. We found them by their emergency beacon. Lucas was hypothermic, barely responsive, lips the color of old concrete. His 2 companions were in better shape but not by much. We got all 3 aboard. We got out. The helicopter took a second hard hit on the climb back. Declan held the instrument panel like she was daring it to argue with her. She didn't say anything, neither did I. We put the aircraft down at 3:15 in the morning. Lucas Ferraro went to the hospital in Terrace. He came home 12 days later with frostbite on 3 fingers that healed completely. The other 2 hikers came home in 4 days. I came home to a formal insubordination investigation. Regional command moved fast. Within 48 hours, a version of events was circulating. Reckless disregard for operational safety protocols, unauthorized flight, endangered personnel. Every word drafted to make the story about my judgment, rather than the judgment that had left 3 civilians on a mountain ledge, and then issued an order to leave them there overnight. The commanding officer who'd issued the stand-down, Director Fenton, 54 years old, 20 years behind a desk in Prince George, the kind of manager who confused protocol compliance with actual leadership, had connections. The administrative kind, which is sometimes worse than political. He had allies in the right offices and a talent for the kind of quiet narrative management that doesn't leave fingerprints. I called home. I'd like to say I didn't. I'd like to say I was past that by 33, past the reflex that sends you reaching for your mother when things go sideways in the world, the way you reach for the wall in the dark. But I hadn't slept in 36 hours and I was sitting in a staff room at the Terrace Airport, waiting to be interviewed by a review board, and I picked up the phone and I called my mother. I told her everything, the storm, the ledge, the boy, the stand-down order, the investigation, the way the story was already being shaped in ways that had nothing to do with what actually happened. I told her about the 40-foot drop in the dark and Declan's steady on the panel. I told her that I was scared, not of the investigation, not exactly. Scared of being erased, of having the thing I did get turned into evidence of the thing I shouldn't have done. She listened. My mother is a good listener when she wants something from the listening. She waited until I'd finished. Then she said, "Well, maybe this is what happens when you make everything so complicated." She wasn't angry. She wasn't even unkind. Exactly. She said it the way you'd say the weather was turning, observational, almost gentle, the tone of someone who'd always expected rain and felt no particular satisfaction in being right. Then she hung up. I held the phone against my ear longer than I should have. The clock on the staff room wall said 11:47 p.m. I watched the second hand move, 3 full rotations before I put the phone down. 4 days later, my partner of 6 years left, not because of the investigation, or not only because of it. He said he'd been thinking about it for a while. He said our lives had been moving in different directions. He said a lot of things that added up to. I looked up one day and realized you weren't what I'd planned for. He left the apartment key on the counter beside the kettle, and I found it there on a Tuesday morning when I came home from a debrief. He didn't say he was sorry. He said he needed it settled before it affected his clearance at work. The home front collapsed faster than a helicopter taking fire and with less warning. The only person who held the line was my old flight instructor, a retired group captain who now consulted for the base on training standards. She had no authority over my case, no official standing at all. What she had was a telephone and 30 years of knowing how these things worked. She made 3 calls in 48 hours, none of which I was ever told the details of, and 2 weeks later my review board outcome was reclassified to a formal caution rather than a dismissal. "You're going to go back to work," she told me, standing in a windowless office at the base, door closed, voice as steady as a compass heading. "And you're going to be better than anyone they've got. You don't win this in a boardroom. You win it in the field, one call at a time until the record speaks for itself. Am I clear?" I said yes. She said, "Good, now go be so good they can't look away." Director Fenton received a national commendation for public safety leadership 18 months later, a ceremony in Vancouver. The BC Search and Rescue Association, the province's emergency management office, a whole room full of people who knew his name from his memos, not from the field, gathering to hand him an award that had been partially funded by the organizations whose personnel had filled the gap his stand-down order created. Walt had known about the ceremony for 2 weeks. He'd driven down from Comox specifically. Standing in my mother's dining room, he told the room what I'd done. Not every detail, some of it was still operationally sensitive, some of it was private in the way that things which happen at 3 a.m. in the dark are simply private. But enough. The ledge, the boy, the storm. Declan's 2 words, the 40-foot drop. The room didn't make noise, it absorbed. My mother stood at the edge of the kitchen doorway with her arms crossed. I watched her face, the small adjustments, the recalculations happening in real time. She was looking for the exit from this moment, and she was smart enough to know she needed to find it carefully. "Walt," her voice gentler now, instructional. "This was years ago, and I'm sure Bryn did her job. I've never said she wasn't capable, I just worry about." Shayla, he used her name. First time all evening, it landed like a hand flat on a table. "Stop." He reached into the folder and set one clipping directly in front of her. He'd underlined a paragraph with a red pen. I didn't look at it. I already knew which one it was. I stood, walked to Walt, shook his hand short, firm, eye to eye. "Thank you for coming," I said, just loud enough for the room to hear. He leaned close. "Fenton's accepting his commendation tomorrow afternoon, the Pinnacle Hotel, ballroom B, 2 o'clock. One breath. I nodded once. The campaign had begun. I sat in my truck outside my mother's house for a long time after, engine off, hands at 10 and 2, the way they'd always defaulted since my first training flight. The memories didn't come in order, they came in fragments. I was 22, standing in the kitchen of this same house, announcing I wanted to apply to the RCAF flight training program. My mother didn't get angry. She got sorry for me. A gentle, patient sorry, the tone of someone explaining a diagnosis to someone who wasn't quite ready to receive it. "Honey, that's a very hard road. Are you sure that's the right fit for you?" Not an attack. A verdict delivered before trial. Beside her, Violet was on the phone with a friend and didn't look up. She never needed to say anything directly. My mother wielded the blade. Violet just held the door. That was the first time I understood, with the kind of clarity that comes quietly rather than loudly, that my mother hadn't simply failed to believe in me. She had decided, before I was old enough to prove anything at all, that this particular child was not the kind that proved things. The decision had been made once. In 37 years it had not been revised, not once. On the passenger seat, My mother had pressed a Tupperware container of Nanaimo bars into my hands as I left. She made them every Christmas and every one of Violet's birthdays, and the year Violet got her first condo, and approximately never in the direction of me or anything I'd done. I set the container on the back seat without opening it. The Pinnacle Hotel's Ballroom B had a view of the harbor. 200 people, provincial officials, emergency management directors, representatives from SAR associations across BC and Alberta, red and white centerpieces, the smell of hotel coffee that had been sitting too long. I was not on the guest list. I wore my operational jacket, not the formal version, the field one, the one with the unit patch and the rank tabs and 4 years of British Columbia wilderness worked into the fabric in ways no dry cleaner had fully resolved. I walked through the lobby and nobody stopped me. A coordinator in a headset materialized at the ballroom entrance. "I don't see your name on." "I'm here as a witness," I said. He moved aside. Fenton was working the pre-program reception when I entered. Silver hair, industry handshake, the practiced ease of a man who'd been praised in rooms like this often enough that he'd stopped noticing the praise and started expecting it. His gaze found my jacket from across the room. The smile didn't vanish immediately. It drained, the way warmth leaves a face when something cold moves through it. He crossed to me before the program started. I'd known he would. Men like Fenton cannot leave a variable uncalculated in their own territory. "I didn't expect to see you here." Voice warm, measured. Surveillance disguised as hospitality. "You look well." I looked at his extended hand and let the silence run 3 full seconds. "Well enough to remember November clearly, Director," I said. He lowered his hand. He walked back toward the podium, and I watched his shoulders lock high and rigid, his stride no longer the easy movement of a man at home. He was scared, and he'd just made the mistake of letting me see it. Walt was 2 tables to my left. He gave me one nod. Near the ballroom entrance, and I'd seen them the moment I walked in, because I always scan a room before I do anything else. My mother and Violet stood against the far wall. They'd followed me from Kelowna, a 4-hour drive down the Coquihalla. My mother had needed to see for herself whether I was who Walt claimed or the manageable disappointment she'd spent 37 years administering. Good, she should see all of it. Fenton took the stage to warm applause. He spoke about leadership, about the weight of command decisions, about the responsibility that comes with protecting personnel under dangerous conditions. Every word was a brick in the wall he'd been building for 4 years between himself and what had actually happened on a ledge in the Cassiar Mountains. He looked directly at my table when he said it. Sometimes, in this work, the most courageous thing a leader can do is make the call to protect their people rather than yield to the pressure of the moment. Real leadership isn't about glory, it's about restraint. He aimed it at me like a bearing. He just walked into the open. A chair scraped back, 1 chair, 3rd row, slow and deliberate, the sound cutting across the polished attention of 200 people. Declan stood up. She was in civilian clothes, hair down, holding her program in one hand. She didn't have a microphone, and she didn't need one. I was in that cockpit. 4 words, flat and clear and absolute, the way facts are when they've been carried for 4 years and are finally being set down somewhere public. Every head in the room turned. Fenton gripped the podium edge. "This is not inappropriate." "I was in that cockpit," Declan said again. Same 4 words, same voice. I understood she would say them as many times as necessary. I watched her fly into a whiteout at 2 a.m. after a stand-down order issued from a building 300 kilometers away from the weather system. I watched her land on a ledge I would not have attempted, and I watched a 17-year-old boy get carried out of that helicopter alive. The murmur that moved through the room was not polite. It was the sound of 200 people revising their understanding of what they were attending. A man 3 rows back stood up, gray-haired, SAR vest, the kind of tan that comes from years outside rather than a vacation. "I was at the base that night. I got the radio confirmation when they touched down, 3 for 3. His voice was steady. No extraction order ever came from command. 1 aircraft flew into that zone. From the left side of the room, a woman in emergency management gray stood. "Lucas Ferraro's father has submitted a formal commendation request for the past 3 years. It was declined at the regional level, twice." And then, from the second row, a man I hadn't seen in 4 years. Older, broader in the shoulder, wearing a jacket I recognized from a photograph, his father had sent the previous Christmas with a card that said nothing except his name in his own handwriting. Lucas Ferraro. 21 years old now, he stood without making a speech, without explaining himself. He looked at me across the room and said 6 words, voice cracking on the last one. "She didn't leave me on the ledge." Each testimony fell into the silence the way real things fall, with weight, without theater. Fenton had backed against the wall behind the stage. His commendation sat on a table to his left. Nobody was looking at it. The president of the BC SAR Association rose from the front row. No drama, the careful movement of someone who has been waiting to do something correctly. The incident report from November 2020 has been under administrative review since last spring, she said, voice reaching every corner of the room. As of this week, the formal caution on record has been vacated. The operational record has been corrected. Row by row, the room rose. Not applause. Something older than applause. People standing because standing was the only adequate response to what had just been said out loud in front of 200 witnesses. Near the entrance, I saw my mother slide down the wall until she was sitting on the floor, one hand pressed flat against her mouth. Violet stood behind her, perfectly still, her face emptied of every expression she'd rehearsed for the 4-hour drive. I stood, heels together, and I faced the room. 3 days later, 10 in the morning, 3 knocks at my apartment door in Victoria, soft and uncertain, the knock of someone who doesn't know if they have the right. My mother, no makeup, no performance armor, plain clothes, hair pulled back the way she only ever wore it at home. She was holding a tin of Nanaimo bars, not the Tupperware from Thanksgiving, a proper tin. This was the first time in 37 years those bars had arrived at my door. I stood inside with my hand on the deadbolt. 4 seconds in, 4 seconds hold, 4 seconds out. Then I opened the door. I didn't step back. Bryn. Her voice broke on the first syllable. I'm so sorry, I didn't know, I should have. You didn't know, I said, or you chose not to find out. She blinked. I've had the same phone number for 11 years, I said. You have it. You've called it to ask whether I was coming home for Christmas. You never called it to ask what I was doing when I wasn't. You didn't know because knowing required something from you, and you decided I wasn't worth the asking. She reached for my arm. I stepped back once, nothing dramatic, nothing designed to wound, just a simple adjustment of distance. I'm not doing this because I want you to feel worse, I said. I'm doing it because you need to hear it from me directly, not from Walt, not from a room full of strangers. You chose a newspaper's version of your daughter over a phone call to your daughter. You made that choice more than once. That's not something I can undo for you. She cried. Not the crying of a woman with a strategy, the crying of someone drowning in a shame too large to hold. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I didn't check it then. Later I'd see that Violet had called and then texted 3 minutes after. Can you please just be a little easier on her? She's not handling this well. Not one question about the ledge. Not one question about the 40-foot drop, or the 4 years of carrying an investigation, or the night I sat in a staff room in Terrace, holding a phone against my ear long past the point where anyone was still on the other end. Just, can you make this less inconvenient for the rest of us? That was the last answer I needed. Please go home, I said. Not in anger, not even in grief. In the voice of someone who has spent 4 years making careful decisions under pressure and understands that this is just another one. I closed the door, the deadbolt turned, one short, dry, final sound. That same week, Fenton asked to meet. Tim Hortons on Douglas Street, his choice. Corner booth, large double-double he didn't drink. He looked like a man who'd been carrying something heavy long enough that he'd forgotten what he weighed before it. No staff from either of our organizations. No public. Just a 54-year-old man and the woman he'd spent 4 years trying to make small. He admitted everything, not loudly. The way a person empties their pockets before a long journey, methodical, without pride, because the alternative is carrying it for the rest of your life and finally understanding that the weight is breaking your back. The stand-down order, the way he'd shaped the investigation narrative afterward, the commendations collected over 4 years while the SAR personnel who'd actually worked those files spent the same period cleaning up after his decisions. When he finished, he asked the only question he had left. Why didn't you go to the press sooner? I looked at him across the table. Because carrying you wasn't what I was built for, I said. I had work to do. Every file I cleared, every person who came out of the bush a feet instead of a stretcher, that's what I chose to spend those 4 years on. You were never going to be the story of my career. I paused. You just thought you were. I let him sit with that. You're going to carry November for the rest of your life. There's no commendation, no room full of colleagues, no amount of administrative distance that makes that go away. That's not cruelty. That's what you signed for when you signed the stand down. I left cash on the table for my coffee. I walked out into a Victoria afternoon, gray and mild, the kind of weather that doesn't ask anything of you. 2 weeks later, Walt called. Not about Fenton, not about the ceremony or the review board or my mother, just his voice on the line, straightforward the way he always was. There's a group I run, Wednesday evenings, community center in Courtenay, Sorry, folks, couple of veterans, some first responders, coffee and bad chairs. You want to come? I drove up on a Wednesday, in civilian clothes. The group met in a room with fluorescent lighting and a coffee maker that groaned like it was considering retirement. 12 people in a circle. Nobody performed. Nobody managed the conversation from a comfortable distance outside it. I took the corner chair, back to the wall, clear sightline to both doors. Old habit I'd carry to my grave. I hadn't planned to speak. When the circle came around to me, I looked at the faces. My eyes stopped at a young woman in the far corner, 24, maybe 25, folded forward in her chair, arms on her knees, staring at the floor, with the specific posture of someone who has been carrying something alone long enough that they've started to believe that's simply what carrying feels like. I recognized her immediately, not her face, her posture. It was the mirror image of who I'd been in the months after the investigation, after the phone call that ended without a goodbye, after I found the apartment key beside the kettle. I stood up. "The hardest part isn't the call," I said, voice low. Not the formal version, just the voice I used when I was telling the truth without dressing it up first. "The hardest part is coming home and convincing yourself that being alone with it is keeping you safe. It isn't. It's just quieter. And quiet and safe aren't the same thing." The young woman raised her eyes slowly. "I've heard of you," she said. Her voice came out thin and uneven, the way voices come out when someone has been holding them in too long. "They call you Watershed. What does it mean?" I looked at her for a moment. "A watershed is where the water divides," I said. "Everything on one side flows one way, everything on the other side flows differently. In geography, it marks where the terrain changes." She waited. "For my crew," I said, "it meant something else. It meant that wherever they fell, however far in, however bad the weather, however many orders said stand down, I would find the divide, and I would bring them back to the other side." Her face opened. Not a performance, the specific expression of someone who has been hauling a fact alone for too long and has just heard it named out loud by someone else. Around the circle, the older hands nodded, the slow, weighted nod of people who have been moving toward something for years, without a name for what they were moving toward. I sat back down. Driving home that night down the island highway, I rolled the window down even though it was November and cold enough to see your breath. The Douglas firs on either side of the road were dark against a sky going the color of a bruise healing at the edges. Wet pavement, no radio, just the engine and the kind of quiet that doesn't ask to be filled. I thought about my mother in her house in Kelowna, with the family photograph still on the living room wall. The one from Violet's promotion dinner, the one where everyone had arranged themselves around the people who mattered, and I was somewhere at the edge, not because I'd chosen to stand apart, but because that was the space remaining. I wondered if she'd looked at it differently since the ballroom. I wondered if she'd wondered. I decided it didn't need to matter to me anymore what she did with the photograph. It had never been an accurate document. I thought about Fenton in whatever room he was sitting in tonight, with his commendation and the memory of 200 people watching his version of events dissolve in real time. I thought about Violet somewhere, probably still drafting a message that would make the past month more manageable, more about optics, less about the 37 years underneath it. All of them locked inside the version they'd chosen, the version that required me to be smaller, less capable, more convenient. The version that held up fine until one man stood in a dining room in Kelowna and spread 7 newspaper clippings on a table and said, "Here is what she actually did, and here is why I kept the proof." But not me. I'd flown into every version of that storm. The whiteout in November, the investigation that came after, the phone call where my mother's voice went flat as a dial tone, the years of building a record that nobody in my family had thought to ask about. And I had carried myself out, not because someone came for me, but because every single day I made the decision that I was worth the work of coming back. The road south was long and dark and almost entirely mine. The heater was running, the window was still cracked, and somewhere behind me in Courtenay, in a community center with bad chairs and a groaning coffee maker, a young woman was sitting in a circle of people who had shown up, not because it was tidy or convenient or what anyone's mother had pictured for them, but because the alternative was cracking alone, and that was a choice none of them were willing to make anymore. Watershed at last was at rest. And the thing she understood now, the thing she hadn't known at 22, standing in her mother's kitchen announcing a future that her mother was already preparing to apologize for, was this: the people who diminish you are not doing it because they see you clearly. They're doing it because they cannot afford to see you at full size. That is not your flaw, that is their limitation. And it is not your job to stay small enough to fit inside it.